Hi, I'm Brian from Simply Brian Enterprises and welcome to my channel. In today's video, we're going to take a little bit of a detour from the Pico series and talk about networking, specifically networking as it relates to Linux and the Raspberry Pi. This will be the first in a two-part series. Today we're going to talk about specifically wireless networking, and in the next video we're going to be talking about the wired interface of the Raspberry Pi. So let's dig in. So you can see here, I've got my usual background, my what I call the playground. This is the operating system installation where all of my Top Tech Boy coursework is installed. All of my source code, all of my development environments, etc. And so what we see here is, just kind of mouse around. So here I'm logged into the playground and I've SSH'd into another Pi. This is the Pi 4 8 gig. And you can see here we logged in and I've run this command ifconfig grep ether. And the reason is I want to see the MAC addresses. So this is just a off-the-shelf Pi 4 running a very basic install of Raspberry OS just to get it on my network. And we can see that we have two interfaces. One is the wired interface, one is the Wi-Fi interface. And if we look at these MAC addresses, they match except for the very last digit. The wired interface has a MAC address ending in 1, and the wireless interface has a MAC address ending in 2. Seems reasonable since these are manufactured with, MAC addresses that are going to be sequential. This Pi gets these two MAC addresses, the next Pi in line gets the next two MAC addresses, and so on and so forth. So if we take a look at, I'm going to exit out of here, and we're going to get back to the playground, and I'm going to do the same thing on the playground. Let's look at the MAC addresses on the playground. And oh, well, that's weird. So the first one ends in 55, the second one ends in 10, and these MAC addresses look nothing like each other. What's going on there? Shouldn't they be sequential? Well, to understand what's going on here, we need to understand, first of all, how MAC addresses are assigned. Here I've got a photo of a wireless network adapter, actually a wired adapter, I'm sorry. And you can see that it has a MAC address stamped onto it. The manufacturer has written a MAC address into the firmware and they've placed a sticker on the network card. If I take this network card and I plug it into a computer, I'm going to expect this interface to come up with that MAC address. That is the MAC address that the vendor has specified. Well, does it have to be though? Just because the vendor says this is the MAC address, does it really need to be? I wonder, could it be changed somehow? Well, one thought I had is let's think about a MAC address like a manufacturer suggested retail price. So here I'm at the store and I have an item that's stamped at MSRP of $29.99. Now I would expect if I take this item to the register, we'll assume there's no sales tax in this state, and I bring this item to the register, it's going to be $29.99, right? Can't be any other price, right? Oh, yes, it can. We have a sale. The store is marked at 30% off. Now, when I take that item to the register, it's not going to ring up as $29.99. It's going to ring up at the discounted price. In the same way, we can do something similar with MAC addresses. Just because the manufacturer has written a default MAC address into the firmware, just because they've affixed a sticker to the interface, doesn't mean we have to use it. Ultimately, it is the operating system that decides. When the operating system boots up, it looks at the network cards in the system and it says which interface is going to get which MAC address. Its first source is the default MAC address. This is not a hard, fast requirement. It is merely a suggestion. When this interface comes up, this is the MAC address, this MAC address right here. This is the one we're going to use unless told otherwise. So how do we tell it otherwise? Well, it's going to vary by system, but in the case of Linux, specifically Raspberry OS on a Pi, there is a file that defines what MAC address an interface will get. So here I am on my system. I'm in the directory etc systemd network, and I'm going to look at a file that is called o1-link.mac. Actually, I should say 01-link. Actually, that's not right. Mac.link. I actually typed it wrong. There we go. 01-mac.link. Remember that. I'll put it in the description below as well. And what we see in this file, this is a text file that I created from scratch. And what we see is that we have two sections set in square brackets. So the first section is the match section. And what this section is a list of all the possible default MAC addresses in the hardware that we're going to want to take action on. In this case, I have the Wi-Fi addresses, and you can see them documented here with comments, with or the hashtag for comment. I've got a Pi 4 1 gig, 4 gig, 8 gig, and my Pi 400. Now, I don't yet have my Pi 5 in here, but there's any new Pis that I bring into the house are going to also get added to this file so that I have the default MAC address, the MAC address that the Raspberry Pi Foundation says you will have unless told otherwise. Then in the second section is the link section, and this is where I'm going to specifically tell it which MAC address to use. And if we look closely, we have a setting of MAC address equals, and that MAC address looks suspiciously like the MAC address we saw above. So what it's doing is it's matching, in this case I'm on my 1 gig Pi, it's taking this MAC address, which ends in 5.6. Remember, the wired Ethernet ends in 5.5. So 5.6, naturally the Wi-Fi interface. I'm going to take that MAC address, I'm going to match it, and I'm going to replace it with this MAC address. Now, you might ask, why? Who cares what your MAC address is? You plug in your device to the network, it gets an IP address. Why do we care? Well, I care, and I'll show you why I care. So I have, as I'm sure a lot of you do, MAC addresses assigned on my home router. So we can see that first MAC address in the list is the default MAC address of the Pi 4 8 gig. If we look back, yep, we can still see it here. It ends in C2. And if we come over here, you can see it ends in C2. So that is the Pi 4 8 gig default MAC address. If I put any operating system on that SD card and I don't tell it to do any differently, it's going to use that MAC address, which means it's going to receive that static IP address from the router. Likewise, we can see the MAC address ending in 10, which is the MAC address I've assigned to the playground. That is always going to get an IP address ending in 120. I care about my IP addresses because I'm using DNS entries on my network. So if I want to put a new operating system image on my Pi 4 8 gig, I want to know what IP is it going to get, what host name is it going to get, so I can SSH to it. Similarly with my Pi 400, if I boot my Pi 400 up, what IP address is it going to get? In the case of the SBE Playground, I'm going to do this a little bit differently because you see that operating system image, just showing off my brand new Pi 4 1 gig. Hey, the chip shortage is over. We can get Pis again. Sorry, just had to say that. So here I have my Pi 4 1 gig, and I've got my USB stick, which is off of the playground, and it's booting up on this Pi, and it's getting the IP address that wherever this is plugged into is going to have the same IP. I care about that because in each instance of an installed operating system, you're going to be running SSH, and SSH is going to have its own set of randomly generated unique keys. If I were to take another operating system and boot it on the same Pi and not adjust the MAC addresses, what's going to happen is I'm going to get an error in PuTTY every time I try to connect to it because it says, wait a second, you have this IP address and this name, but these SSH keys don't match. Error, error, error. This is danger, danger. You're logging into a system I can't trust. Likewise with VNC, VNC has SSL keys, or I should say SSL certificates that are unique and randomly generated. So this stick has a set of SSH keys on it. This stick has an SSL certificate for VNC. I want to know that the IP address, host name, SSH keys, and VNC certificate are going to match no matter which system I have this stick plugged into. Because sometimes I want it in the playground, sometimes I want it in the Pi 400, And sometimes, well, let's say something happens to the Pi in the playground and I need to replace it, or I want to repurpose that one and use a different Pi. I want to be able to just pull this stick out, put it in the new Pi, boot it up, and it comes to life on the network. I don't have to do any configuration changes. So anyway, I thought that was kind of a neat idea, and it took me a while to get it really, kind of honed in and figured out. So I wanted to share that with you. I don't know if this is useful information to you. I hope it was. Be sure to leave a comment below if you have any opinions or suggestions on how we can have even more fun with this idea of rewriting MAC addresses. And that concludes this video. I'll see you in the next one when we talk about Ethernet configuration. I'm Brian from Simply Brian Enterprises, and thank you for watching.